everyone, we are going to go ahead and start lesson 3.9, the Abolitionist and Women's Movement. The objective for today is to describe how during the 1830s the movement to end slavery gained strength and inspired the women's movement. So remember, the 1830s, we are still part of that Second Great Awakening, this inspiration about sin and ending sin and improving society. And those concepts carried over into the idea of abolitionists. Abolitionists were people that wanted to abolish slavery. And their goal was emancipation. And emancipation is freedom of enslaved peoples. Two famous abolitionists are right here to our left. We have Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass wrote a biography. So he wrote his own biography on being enslaved in Maryland. So not that far from here. And this brought a lot of awareness to slavery and what it was like to be an enslaved person. He was a phenomenal writer and really inspired people to join the abolitionist movement. We also have right here to our right, William Lloyd Garrison. And he was the author of The Liberator that we see right here to the right. Which was a newspaper or a publication that was an abolitionist newspaper. Two other famous abolitionists, well, there were many famous abolitionists, but two others that we should also talk about was Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And both of these women were very key and essential in spreading the word of abolitionism. Again, both women, phenomenal speakers and writers. A second event to really inspire the abolitionist movement was the Amistad, and this was a slave ship. That was overtaken by the enslaved people that it had captive. And what had happened is the slave ship was eventually captured and then taken back to the United States. And the enslaved individuals that had overtaken the ship were then put into jail and tried. And actually, the former president, John Quincy Adams, was the one who defended them to the Supreme Court. The individuals, the enslaved peoples, were acquitted. So they were not found guilty of any crime. And this is super important because it shows us that the tide is starting to shift, that the movement for slavery is starting to move the other way against slavery, that the Supreme Court now understands the evils of slavery. People within the government are starting to understand the evils of slavery and enslaved peoples. And we're starting to see that shift and that movement towards abolitionism. And this movement had a very strong impact on the women's movement. A lot of women supported abolitionism, and because of that, were also inspired to try to fight for their own equality and for their own rights, based off of what they saw people doing to try to fight and end slavery. So the women's movement came out of this idea of the cult of domesticity. And this idea where that women were kind of these role models for the home. And as you got married, and when you became married, even though you were a role model for the home, you didn't have any rights. All of your rights were taken away from you when you got married. You couldn't own property. You couldn't go vote. There were no rights for a married woman. She was just kind of supposed to be this domestic role model for the home, and establish a strong household. And so this obviously led to a lot of discontent amongst women in the fact that they wanted to have more rights than what they currently had. And this led us to the Seneca Falls Convention, which we see the building here below us. This was the Seneca Falls Convention. And the Seneca Falls Convention, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke. And the goal was to fight for the rights of women to own property, be able to get a divorce, be able to be educated, some of the important people that attended were Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, here is where she gave her famous speech that says, "Ain't I a woman?" If you've never read it, I highly recommend you read it. And essentially she was saying that abolitionists need to support women too. So that as an abolitionist, she felt like there was a lot of support to free the men, but maybe not as much to free women and women's equality. And in addition to this, they also discussed suffrage. And suffrage is the right to vote. So overall, the abolitionist movement and the women's movement were both inspired by or came out of the Second Great Awakening And this idea that to eliminate sins, we have to, or to get closer to God, we need to eliminate sin. And so we started to see more support for the freeing of enslaved individuals. And we started to see women start to organize because of the inspiration of the abolitionist movement to also fight for their own rights and fight for equality.